Hello, and thanks for everybody for being here today. I know it's a packed house, but we'll try and keep it rolling nonetheless. So the paper I kind of wanted to deliver today is going to go through perspectivalism, complexity, and how to deal with complexity in a bit more of a practical setting. So I've got a number of examples I'll go through here, and we'll just get into it. Christopher Priest, 1974 science fiction novel, Inverted World, postulates a moving city called Earth that navigates the planet by means of a series of tracks which must be continually laid for its planned journey. For reasons which become clear throughout the novel, the city is striving to reach a shifting point called optimum, which always lies ahead of its projected path. The reader begins to understand the peculiar nature of the city through the primary narrator of the novel, Hellward Mann, a surveyor of the city and one of the few who is allowed outside of this tightly managed community. In his journeys, Mann encounters weird fields of distortion as he moves further from the city. When traveling behind the city to escort some women southward, he discovers that people, objects, and even the landscape around him begin to flatten horizontally, and a strong force pulls him further southward. Time itself stretches, and he finds upon his return to the city that a journey which from his viewpoint has taken days actually took months. The optimum is revealed to be a mysterious power source which the city's founder tapped after a global devastation and used to create the safe haven of a city to carry on civilization. However, this power source creates perceptual and genetic distortions for those enshrined in its bubble. And the denizens of the city, who believe that they are the last remnants of the earth, are actually on earth, kept enthralled to their tradition through the warped perspective generated by the optimum. Another point I was going to mention here, but sort of skipped over, when he goes in front of the city, it appears that people and objects stretch vertically, and time itself begins to, what appears to him from his perspective, where time appears to be take months. When he returns to the city, it appears to have only been days. So it has a sort of opposite reaction from when he goes behind the city. So we live, if not exactly in the inverted world of Priest fiction, then at least a fractured one, where the perspectives of multiple worlds compete for dominance. It seems that rather than one power steadfastly laying a path to the future, we have multiple forces laying tracks by altogether different lengths. And the trains which follow barrel alongside one another, sometimes colliding with spectacular devastation. Our world has become increasingly complex, stratified, and not always compatible. We require the means to translate across perspectival dislocations and grasp hold of points of orientation which allow us to steer a vast array of systems. But how are we to do this when the various models we have of the world seem so alienated from one another? The systems theorist, R. Felix Gehr, identifies alienation as an information processing problem, which inhibits the subject's decisional and steering capacity, resulting in a breakdown of social function. He argues that the modern forms of alienation are qualitatively distinct from those of pre-modern societies, which also experience alienation in forms of psychological, spiritual, or social trauma. While these maladies have not disappeared, what separates the modern world from past ones is what he calls an accelerating complexity differential. Increasing internal complexity or modes of informational processing are required to compensate for the development of external complexity. Quote, only internal variety within the system itself can force down the variety due to the system's environment. The system's codes must be as highly differentiated as the potentially system-relevant variety obtaining in the environment. If the system is to perceive this variety at all, let alone make fully sense of it and be able to steer it, one cannot perceive something one cannot place. Information that is overly complex relative to the degree of differentiation of the individual's codes, influenced by his educational level, IQ, level of emotional development, previous experiences, etc., goes in one ear and out the other without registering, end quote. So, few would deny that we live in an age of increasing complexity. What exactly that means, however, is open to further definition, as it is often thrown out as a platitude. The complexity sciences have attempted to provide the term with more rigorous descriptive and explanatory goals, rising in the 70s from an interdisciplinary assortment of fields, cybernetics, economics, computer sciences, you could go on here, philosophy, biology, artificial intelligence. What we now know more by the more formal title of complexity theory comes in a variety of flavors and has varied applications depending on its deployment. Currently, it has strong applications in climate modeling, economic prediction, biology, and the computer sciences. Unsurprisingly, and perhaps a little ironically, the study of complexity theory is itself a complex endeavor. In the interest of brevity, then, I will not focus on all the species available, but we use a broad definition of complexity that captures the salient features we are interested in for the purposes of this discussion. In a basic sense, complex systems are those which are said to subsist in a state between order and randomness, and the laws governing the system are relatively hard to describe or predict, but not impossible. So these are kind of dynamic systems that build to a level of organization. Under the computational perspective, the question of whether or not something is hard to describe is given a precise definition in relation to the problem of computability. This is famously formalized in the P versus NP problem, or polynomial versus non-deterministic polynomial time. It has to do with whether or not any problem that can be quickly checked by a computer can also be quickly solved by a computer. It's kind of a complex problem, really. Like, I mean, there are two different sort of problem spaces, polynomial time and non-deterministic polynomial time, and one is sort of like exponentially expanding beyond the other. It's one of these sort of million-dollar mathematical questions that if it could be solved, if it's P does equal NP, it would have massive ramifications for discovering a number of very hard math problems and for solving things within economics, very broad applications. Anyway, but I'll return to this issue later, but let us simply say for now that computational power plays a large role in not only defining what is a complex system, but the degree of sophistication to which our models are capable of accurately representing a complex system. As mentioned previously, Geier approaches alienation as an informational problem. We accept, as it seems we must, the finitude of any one human being to come to terms with the complexity of the contemporary situation. Deficits will naturally arise. No one person can hold in their head the complex financial models now used by Wall Street to game the system, or the models used to gauge the various causes, effects, and feedback loops of the Earth's climate system as interactive anthropogenic activity. Where Geier argues that further individual sophistication is required to deal with external complexity, there is an alternative remedy: to increase or augment existing human capacities with external aids. This, however, raises an additional problem, and this is where we must apply some techniques of complexity theory. How do we mediate between these external aids and our limited capacities in a manner that responsibly manages the various levels of sophistication and feedback without further disruptive consequences? So we know that our knowledge is flawed. Evolution does not really select for representational accuracy, but representational fitness given a set of environmental constraints. Consider the case of the Australian jewel beetle. The insect almost faced extinction because the males of the species were hardwired to identify certain representational triggers, and the females usually having to do with like how sort of glossy brown color and little bumps that appeared to them. In Australia, there's a type of beer bottle called a stubby that when thrown carelessly away or something, it kind of perfectly fits the male jewel beetle's behavior pattern of what is the perfect like female mate. So these beetles almost went extinct because all the males were swarming at these glass beer bottles rather than like mating with nearby suitable females, essentially decimating the reproductive cycle. Well, human beings have much more robust and reflexive representational systems than jewel beetles. Our senses are still a byproduct of evolutionary constraints whose cost-benefit parameters result in cognitive biases. Cognitive scientist Donald D. Hoffman argues for interface theory of perception, where he likens the given human perceptual system to the generation of icons on a desktop. We see icons of the world through the filter of colors and shapes, but these are not accurate representations of the things in themselves. Or to put it in Kantian terms, we do not see the world directly, but mediated and constrained by the conditions of our thought. Overstretching analogies between human cognition and computational systems can be misleading, but nonetheless, there is a useful comparison to be made here. In addition to investigating neurobiology, artificial intelligence is one of the foremost tools we have at the moment for decoding the mysteries of consciousness. Comparisons with AI help us to understand the peculiar limits and functions of human capacities. Here I'd like to bring up the peculiar problem of logical omniscience. That is, what does it mean to say that I know something? For example, I can know how to play chess without always knowing the most optimal move to make in a game. But can it be said that I really know chess if I do not always know the logical consequences of every possible move? Similarly, human beings can be shown to be proficient with problems when asked in a particular way, but not asked in another way. So if you were asked to locate the multiple of 41 times 67, you could easily arrive at 2,747. When asked to get the prime factors of 2,747, it may not be as easy of a problem for you to calculate, despite the fact that the content of the problems is the same. The computer scientist Scott Aronson suggests that knowledge in this case is not so much really a question of whether or not we know the truth or falsity of some state of facts, but, quote, do you possess an internal algorithm by which you can answer a large and possibly unbounded set of questions of some form, end quote. To this he appends the important proviso, in a reasonable amount of time. So, until very recently, computers bested human opponents through sheer brute force computation of potential moves. In certain games, such as checkers, it could be said that computers really are logically omniscient about which is the best possible move to make. This gets a little bit more complex when you start talking about chess because the problem space gets more complex. But computers are able to process, say that they possess a sort of omniscience rather than a virtual know-how in the same way that human beings do. But computers are able to process much larger arrays of data than human beings, though they may not have the most efficient algorithms for locating some types of patterns in that data. Deep learning algorithms are changing this, and some would argue making machines closer to human learning. It's a tricky subject. But while human beings excel at certain types of problems, such as composing literature, making art, and even writing computer algorithms, this may soon change. What I wish to point out here, however, is that the human style has a kind of algorithm which is particularly efficient for calculating some problems, those which are local to the human interface and mesh well with our perceptual sensibilities, but not the kind of complex abstract problems for which machines are able to quickly and efficiently compute solutions. What we will need are representations which can connect algorithms between the two interfaces, the human and the computational model. So Frederick Jameson has a sort of famous conception of cognitive mapping, which calls for the renewal of the pedagogical function of art, a form of representation which is equal to the abstract totality and complexity of contemporary capitalism. Jameson, writing in 1990, echoes Gayer's concerns. Quote, there comes into being then a situation which we can say that if individual experience is authentic, then it cannot be true, and that if a scientific or cognitive model of the same content is true, then it escapes individual experience. So again, you have this sort of informational processing problem where it's like our sort of experience of the world doesn't represent things accurately, but there are models of more accurate things out there, but they don't feed into our sort of understanding. Much ink has been spilled both advocating for and critiquing cognitive mapping, but everyone agrees that it poses enormous epistemological difficulties. Jameson himself notes that conspiracy theory might be regarded as a degraded form of cognitive mapping, one that reduces the problematics of structural abstraction to a simplistic narrative. A good cognitive map must be able to represent complex and dynamic states with a high degree of accuracy if it is to avoid the pitfalls of a degraded narrative. This presents two major but related epistemic challenges. One, avoiding reification to a static model, and two, providing efficient access to that model so that it becomes available for correction and action. At the heart of both these issues is a problem of reductionism. Squabbling over what it would mean to produce an accurate cognitive map has confined the majority of the conversation around cognitive mapping to a mere abstract possibility or a cited critique. But what if there was a different approach? Complexity theory's suite of tools offers new methods of evaluating, integrating partial theories, and handling reduction honestly. In complexity theory, reductionism operates on the methodological level to clarify or expose intra- or intersystematic elements which may have not been previously intelligible. Reductions become then useful fictions, which, while not strictly true, provide a position of orientation within or between larger frameworks. Reduction need not be viewed as wholly negative, so long as we are aware of the constraints it imposes. This is where heuristics come in. So the term heuristic was popularly introduced in discussions of human decision-making by the economist, social theorist, and computational scientist Herbert Simon. Broadly, it describes a problem-solving tool which enables solutions through the transformation of one problem into another whose available pattern is more readily grasped. Let me provide a short example. Imagine you have accidentally exited the subway at the wrong stop. You look around to orient yourself and see several landmarks that you recognize. Realizing that your destination is somewhere south of One World Trade Center, you begin to head in the direction of that building. As you turn down one street, you look up the building again and see that it's changed position relative to you, and that you are now heading farther north than you intended. You turn down another street and the building now appears to be directly ahead of you. Through this process of observation and correction, you eventually locate your original destination. This navigation heuristic, and this is a really simple example, but this navigation heuristic transforms the problem of locating a specific destination into the problem of gauging one's position relative to a building. As the problem demonstrates, these solutions are not always optimal, but they can be efficient given limited resources. Furthermore, because heuristics are often biased towards the limits of their original frame of reference, that is to say, reductive, they tend to fail in predictable ways when applied to more general frames. They are not necessarily correct solutions, but ones considered good enough to achieve certain results. So I'd like to pull in a sort of example to maybe hopefully illustrate all this and bring it together in a particular way. I do not think the territory here really solves the problem, like what I've gone over really solves the problem of alienation that we opened the paper up with, but I hope that it suggests some fertile terrain for further investigation. Keeping with the theme of navigation, I'd like to mention the work of anthropologist Edwin Hutchins. Hutchins' particular concern is with what he calls distributed cognition, or the organization of tasks through the coordination of individuals and artifacts to achieve a common goal. He produces a unique comparison of Western and Micronesian navigation systems. Micronesians primarily use a stellar path to navigate, though there are many other indicators drawn from the environment. The major distinction between Western and the Micronesian system, however, is that while the Western system is dependent on spatial representation drawn from a vertical perspective, the Micronesian system supposes a temporal representation with the perspective of the navigator at the center, and the sidereal points and other indicators revolving around the position. Positions of the star paths provide points of reference as they proceed across the horizon in a successive and regular manner. This is because in the area of the world they're navigating, you have pretty much a complete view of the sort of stellar globe, so you get a regular access to these things, assuming the weather is clear. So the navigator divides the journey into a series of segments based on epochs or the position of known islands under certain stars. As the journey proceeds, the canoe is regarded as a fixed point, while the navigator updates the epoch positions based upon how much time has passed. Without significant external storage systems, written language, maps, compasses, etc., the Micronesian system is significantly more computationally efficient for an unaided human memory. As a consequence of the system, however, the navigator will sometimes generate artificial reference points to aid in the efficiency of the calculation. These reference points were misinterpreted by Westerners as actual landmarks, but these so-called phantom islands are actually a projection of the journey in the mind of the navigator, aiding in the calculation process, and allowing the navigator to process direction by triangulating between the canoe, the star paths, and epoch segments. Similar to my previous example of navigating New York, epoch segments are not so much an indication of units of distance between the navigator's position and intended destination, but a means of arriving at the bearing of the destination. So Hutchins is able to frame this comparative study by referring to a generalized computational account that can reconcile the differences in the frames of representation. He argues that early Westerners developed systems which were roughly analogous to the epoch system, but diverged radically with the invention of external storage systems, maps, compasses, astrocharts, etc. These crystallized a distinct conceptual frame which became more reliant on abstract global models than local orientation. So to be clear, I don't intend to argue for the superiority of one system or the other, but instead recommend the utilization of both as necessary for dealing with distinct problems of navigation. We might compare the relatively primitive mapping devices of Westerners to our complex computational models. The Micronesian system might be seen in light of heuristics, a sophisticated orientation strategy which allows the user to make a decision while subject to bounded knowledge. Whereas models could be characterized as maps which provide the notable objects and relations within a restricted territory, heuristics are more like a compass which point you in the direction you need to travel. Both are cognitive aids, but heuristics are more amenable to unaided cognition due to their high compression rate. A complex model might require significant external storage to achieve the necessary degree of accuracy, but a heuristic can lead to a feature of that model for much lower cost. So when shifting between local positions and global structures, we require techniques that can not only mitigate the alienating features of global abstractions, but embrace and coordinate local action with our best understanding of these abstractions. To return to the story of the inverted world, we need to provide the denizens of the city of Earth with a means of reconciling the distorted interface with that of the world as it truly is. Models may be able to map the distorted topology of the inverted world onto our understanding of the real world. We have to provide new heuristics or new interfaces that unfold this provincial relation and allow the navigation of the wider world. So I guess this is the sort of major picture I'm presenting, and I hope some of this is somewhat clear in terms of the relation between models, heuristics, and kind of the need for some sort of compression between our mode of operation and these sort of external mediators. I just want to make a last word about art, particularly contemporary art and representation. I think the relation between complex models and the human interface poses a unique representational challenge, one which is currently outside the dialectic of contemporary art. As Jameson suggests, the pedagogical role which art once fulfilled has largely been laid by the wayside. Didacticism is now seen to be almost wholly negative trait, a strategy of presentation appealing solely to subjective framing have come to take precedence in the contemporary art paradigm. The gesture towards a contemporary art paradigm may be seem to be contentious, and it would take a while to elaborate exactly what that is. I will do a brief thing, kind of mostly drawn off of Suhail Malik's lectures on the necessity of contemporary art, which a necessity of exiting from contemporary art, which you can find online, which you give an artist space. His thesis is that contemporary art is not a unified genre, but an ideological totality, which is coterminous with the neoliberal worldview. This ideology embraces the problem of indeterminacy, or the inability to reliably reconcile individual perspectives with any universal perspective, as a replicative strategy which not only favors but solicits the claims of a free subject over any balancing hegemonic claims. So it's kind of asymmetrically oriented towards the subject. Contemporary art mistakes its inability to represent the totality of the present from any one perspective for an indexical statement about the incompleteness of the present as a totality, and thus positions itself as an accurate representation of the contemporary situation. So you kind of have this almost category error between the incompleteness of one particular perspectival view and the inability to grasp the totality of the present from multiple views. And it mistakes this sort of lack in our sort of knowledge as being actually the case about what the world is. So it's kind of a weird inverted idealism. However, since it has raised this negational foreclosure to an absolute, it cannot provide any positive orientation in respect of how things are, but only repeat its own inadequacy ad nauseum. Art becomes nothing more than a frictionless bubble where the subject ratifies differences without distinction in a continual state of unfreedom. Note that this sort of represents the neoliberal consumer subject to a T. You just have sort of endless varieties of choice. In such a state, capitalist trajectories reassert their power as the only real alternative, as no orientation is provided to countermand them. Contemporary art merely identifies a sequence of symptoms, but is incapable of coordinating an alternative. The most damning tell that this is the case is the fact that market value ultimately winds up asserting the value of contemporary art, since it lacks any normative conditions which would posit an alternative criteria for aesthetic valuation. So I'll just kind of set forth a deeply truncated and probably very flawed overview of art history to get to my very last point here. Allegorical models of art were inextricably bound to the metaphysics which conditioned our understanding of the world, such as you would find in medieval or Baroque art. They served a pedagogical function by producing representations which keyed the viewer into their role in the cosmic order. Modernism broke down the unitary authority of these models, but was incapable of replacing these master narratives with a suitable representational schema. Some notable attempts were made, such as the project The Constructivists, which tried to locate a universal geometric language, but these two were felled by the same sort of credulity which inspired the modernist revolution to begin with. Thereafter, modernism resigned to the state of postmodern skepticism, which leads directly to the interminable reign of contemporary art. The implications of what I'm trying to present here today are not to argue for return to the authority of some unitary metaphysical foundation, but rather the navigation and convergence of our best models. Now, it's the case that these representations are partial and distinct from the objects that they represent, as to say, not strictly true. It is also the case that the totality of knowledge represented by these models is outside the province of any one human being to master. Nonetheless, our sophisticated models not only offer the best potential access to the world outside of us, but also make non-trivial claims about how that world functions, which has implications for the kinds of decisions we make in relation to them. So that they can't be kind of indeterminate in the same way that the sort of reference to the space of contemporary art does. What I'm concerned with here, though, is actually the transfer between models, in particular between our best model of human cognition and that of our other best models. It is therefore part of a pragmatic enterprise, not a foundational one. This is why I focus on the analogy of the interface, the notion that we already represent the world according to a particular algorithm or design. I mean, not to get all, creationist there or anything. But in a sense, what I intend is a kind of allegorical mode of representation, one not built on metaphysics, but the translation between models, a sort of user interface design relating principles of human perception to abstract models of external phenomena. Heuristics are key to this focus because they present a means of envisioning compression at the experiential level for limited beings. There are difficult computational problems, again, the P versus NP, in locating the best algorithms to do this. As I mentioned before, the human mode is still better than computers at finding patterns related to our perceptual interface and interweaving the local conditions of culture and environment into a system of representation. One of the elements that my reflection on the Micronesian navigation system glossed over is that the learning of the techniques needed to become a navigator or pass through an oral tradition embedded in song and culture. We must consider ways of embedding our best models in modes of access that are close to the human interface. Tools that grab hold of the tendencies already given to lead somewhere new. In this view, art becomes technology, bootstrapping our perceptual abilities to engage our best conceptions of the world as we know it, and helping to organize access for further exploration and action. So that's it.